This week, we're speaking with Mark Robinson, and he is someone who calls himself the shitty leadership guy. We're going to be talking all about leadership in general, but also how people make behavioral decisions that are perhaps not always in their best interest and how that pertains to leadership. Stick around. This is Make Better Wealth Decisions, a podcast about financial blind spots, decision making, and how the reality of higher rates, global tensions, and tariff instability impact your investments. I'm your host, John DeGuy, a portfolio manager with Design Securities in Toronto. So as I mentioned a moment ago, we're speaking with Mark Robinson. He is the shitty leadership guy, and his website is shittyleaders.ca. I'm going to take a moment to read a one paragraph excerpt from his website to give you a sense of what we're in for today. He says this: self-deception isn't a leadership or finance problem. It's a human problem. Unmasking your illusions is about recognizing the lies we tell ourselves, why we cling to them, and how to finally break free. If you want better outcomes in money, in relationships, or in life, you've got to stop outsourcing accountability and start challenging your own thinking, because the longer you protect your illusions, the more expensive they become. Mark, you've got a new book out, don't you? What's it called?
I do, absolutely, John. Unmasking Your Illusion. It's dropping on the 16th of May, and very excited. It's my fourth book, which is crazy to me, but it is my fourth book, and it is all about what you just said. So very excited to be here.
And that's, of course, why I wanted you on this week, because I figured it's a great way to talk about the self-deception and leadership and biases in decision-making, which is a great dovetail to not only the mandate of this podcast, Make Better Wealth Decisions, but it also dovetails with my book, which I have over my corner there, which is over my shoulder, which is called Bullshift. Yeah, and there are a lot of similarities I found as I got to know you more. I realized that you and I think a lot alike. And
absolutely.
So let's begin by having you do a very brief overview before we get into your book about what you do in your day job, what your consulting is, what your shtick is.
Absolutely. I'd be happy to. So, very quickly, I refer to myself as the shitty leadership guy because it kind of creates a response and it invokes a reaction. And most of the time it's a positive reaction, tongue-in-cheek humor. People get the concept of where we're going with this. But one of the things that I always like to point out is that, all joking aside, shitty leaders are not shitty people. And that's really the fundamental sort of disclaimer that I tell people so I don't get punched. But ultimately, it's really about understanding your behaviors, understanding your true level of self-awareness. Do you make feedback about yourself, or do you make it about the staff you're trying to support? And do you live in a mask where you focus on true authenticity, true relationships, and really being yourself? The evolution of my books, book one is, how to guide for shitty leaders to become less shitty. Book two breaks down active leadership, which is about three key pillars, which is about self-awareness, your leadership brand, and effective feedback delivery. I always like to tell people, welcome to leadership. It's no longer about you. And how do you make your leadership about the people that you're supposed to be supporting? A lot of feedback between books one and two. So book three, which I have here, is all about how to unshitify your life, both at home and work. And it really takes a deeper dive. A lot of feedback I received was in my consulting practices that a lot of the things you do in leadership cross over to home. And of course they will. Just like book four, if you're masking who you are and you're not truly being yourself, some people don't know what that means. And if you're doing that at work, it's going to cross over to home. And this brings us to book four. And here we are today, helping yourself become the person that you think you are or the person that you'd like to be.
And as that pertains to people who give financial advice, a lot of that spills over. A lot of financial advisors could use some more self-awareness, but also a lot of financial advisors will say their leadership is involved in behavioral coaching. So advisors will say, I'm a behavioral coach. Well, when you say you're a behavioral coach, what you're doing is you're leading the way other people are hopefully going to behave. And so your own ability to self-assess will have an impact on your ability to lead. So I think there's a real natural tie-in between your angle and mine. Let's begin there. So I like to talk, as I think the people watching the podcast will know, I speak frequently about optimism bias.
Yes.
And the way you and I would describe it is it's the illusion of, well, this won't happen to me. You understand that bad things will happen, but for whatever reason, you think you're immune. So my focus is that investors assume they're immune to financial slumps and ignoring problems and thinking that they're going to be fine and that whatever happens will happen, but it won't happen to them and that somehow they're special.
Yes.
How does that pertain to the work that you do in your response?
It's such a great question. And I really like that we align on optimism bias. We just call it different things, but at the end of the day, it's the same thing. For me, people convince themselves that their relationships, health, personal choices, that everything will somehow work out until reality sometimes proves otherwise. And it's great to have that optimism, but optimism can sometimes be jaded by how you think or how you perceive the world or how you market yourself. So to me, optimism bias is that little voice in your head that's saying, sure, this has gone horribly wrong for other people, but I'm built differently. I hear that so many times. I'm built differently. So spoiler alert, most people are not. And so people tend to romanticize their ability to dodge consequences, whether it's financially, emotional, relationship wise. And is this ego-based fantasy or borderline stupidity? I won't get caught. It won't happen to me. I remember as a child, was at a park and was on the seesaw. I think we used to call it a teeter-totter. Anyway, long story short, I'm on it and my friends let it go. So it dropped and my foot was underneath. So I ended up breaking a few bones. So of course I had to get driven to the hospital by my friends' parents. My mother came eventually and was like, I've never broken a bone and I can't believe this happened and I can't believe you did this. Being a typical mother to a 13-year-old. Not a week later, she walked into her desk at work with her shoes off and broke her toe. So claiming that she's never broken a bone in her body. So things happen. And it's funny how it's never going to happen to me, but then when you least expect it, it does. So how many times have you said those things? It won't happen to me right before it did. So I was trying to think of some common examples that sort of puts this into reality. And it's things like job security. People think they're in a cushy job, so they don't save for that rainy day. They don't save for the future. Risk management. Organizations underestimate potential threats. So are you planning for risk? Are you planning for when things go south? Nobody could have anticipated, where the world is today. I don't know many people who might have forward thought where we are, but maybe some have. Job applications. I'm a shoo-in for this job. I'm going to throw my hat in the ring. And then, within a day, you get a Dear John letter, pun intended, I guess, right? Health and safety. Individuals buying a helmet or not buying a helmet because they don't think that they're ever going to get into an accident. I'd say the biggest one that came to mind as I was preparing for this is the people who text and drive. Those accidents happen to other people. It won't happen to me. So really, we have to get to ourselves to get to that stage to think, I'm different is ego talking. It's not logic. And it's that voice of self-importance convincing you that the rules don't apply and that you can somehow defy the odds. And different isn't special. It's usually sometimes just delusional.
Right.
And so really for me, optimum bias is just arrogance in disguise when you think about it. It's your ego whispering bedtime stories to keep reality from waking you up. And that to me is always fascinating. So it's really about what would happen if you began thinking along the lines of what's the worst that could happen? And that's not taking this from optimism bias to pessimistic, it's rationalizing not to live in fear of worst case scenario. But what if you controlled the narrative or controlled the input so that you're thinking more rationally as opposed to just being one-sided? And so that would be part of the antidote for that.
One of the phrases I use frequently when I talk to guests is that people who rationalize tell rational lies. And it's exactly as you say, it's the things that you tell yourself. I don't know, I can't recall what your exact terminology was, but it's the bedtime stories that you use to justify your behavior after the fact. And that's the sort of thing that a lot of people just do not want to come to terms with. They will go to great lengths to justify what they're doing. And a lot of decisions are made emotionally, and then they try to justify them after the fact with some modicum of rationality. I did want to say one thing that I think I've also mentioned before on the podcast, and you might not be familiar with it, but Daniel Kahneman, the great Nobel laureate who died last year, who is the father of behavioral finance, talks a lot about doing what's called a pre-mortem, which is where you actually spend some time actively thinking about what could go wrong. So, on TV shows where you have the coroner doing a post-mortem to try to figure out how the person died and was it shady and was there any kind of foul play involved. A pre-mortem is the active engagement in before you engage in anything of any consequence, who you might want to marry, whether you should start that business, whether you should change your business model, whether you should try to open up new markets, whatever it is you're doing, whether you should buy this cryptocurrency, whatever. You should stop and say, okay, now let's be conscious about this. Let's write down a year from now, what's the worst that could happen? How could it be? What will my life look like then? The research actually shows that if you actively think about what could go wrong, you do make better decisions because that little voice telling you the bedtime stories is going to be tamped down a little bit and you're going to be making decisions with a little more reality. So wonderful. Let's talk about behavioral biases. One of the other things that you and I both talk about and how your mind will trick us into making bad decisions or at least incomplete decisions or decisions that are perhaps unreasonable and they're based on emotion or overconfidence or selective thinking. What are your thoughts on behavioral biases?
People justify toxic habits. They avoid uncomfortable truths, so they double down on bad decisions rather than admit they were wrong. Part of what I write about in all of my books that sort of started this ego continuum journey and this sort of awareness of self-awareness is the concept that, do you need to be right or do you want to be kind? And it's leading, Deepak talks a lot about right versus kind. And that's kind of where the evolution of this going further sort of, started. And it's amazing to me that the fear of being wrong can be so powerful in your listener's line of work that people will be willing to lose money rather than admit fault. And I find that absolutely mind-blowing. So really, for me, the breakdown of this would be, was that a conscious choice or not a conscious choice? And so some biases apply to life choices where we justify red flags, stick with bad jobs, chase validation. We're not stuck, we're stubborn and very selective about what we're willing to admit. And the question really for your listeners is, why is fault so terrifying for some? When you really break it down and think about it. And are you self-aware enough to know that you're truly self-aware or not self-aware? And in my practice, when I meet people, whether it's coaching or going into consult leadership development with an organization, I'll always ask, so are you self-aware? I love asking a group of people, are you self-aware? Because everyone puts their hand up. And then I'm like, how do you know? How do you know you're self-aware? And then half the hands go down. Then we start to go into a deeper conversation. And usually you get the one person that says, I don't want to talk to you anymore. I'm like, cool. Then I've struck a nerve and that's awesome. You're exactly where we wanted you to be. Because if this was comfortable, I wouldn't be writing books about it. People will sabotage something in their present or in their future to protect a version of themselves that actually never existed. That blows my mind when I think about that.
One of the things that you can do is you can get yourself a decision-making buddy, someone that you trust. It could be a spouse, it could be a sibling, a best friend. Bounce the ideas off them and bounce them off them with the context of what you just said a moment ago, Mark. I think I'm doing the right thing here, but I'm self-aware enough to know that I might be biased in what's motivating me and that I want to be right. And because I want to be right, I am being led to a certain outlook and a decision that may not be in my own best interest in the long run. So tell me, friend, am I thinking about this properly? If you were me, what questions would you be asking? And be deliberative. Don't just do it on some superficial, well, I asked, and my buddy Jim said it would be fine. And as a result, I proceeded. No, Jim, seriously, tell me, what could I have done? And if you get your buddy Jim or Betty or Fred or whoever, get the person that you're dealing with to, no, we don't stop until you've told me exactly what you think could go wrong, because you know me or you know the mistakes I've made in the past. You've given me shit over beers on a Friday night saying, why did you do that? Well, okay, this is your chance to give me shit before I do something stupid instead of waiting until after it happens. So let's hear it and actively try to get people to think about what might go wrong. And I think that's the sort of thing where it's really hard for people to be truly reflective about who they are. And as you say, letting the mask down because they're protecting an ego and they don't want the world to see what's underneath, right? It's scary.
That's the nail on the head, because the ego doesn't want to be right. The ego wants to be righteous. And it's not about facts. It's about feelings pretending to be facts. And that's where you get into that hell-bent version of somebody who, I don't necessarily need to be right, but I need you to be wrong. And then that's where the kindness completely just disappears from the conversation. You don't just lie to others. You start rehearsing for the lies to yourself. And when you think about it, is this choice serving your growth or is it stroking your ego? Because growth hurts and it's supposed to, but ego strokes feel better until they don't. It's understanding the ego and that we're all part of our ego. We can close on this section by this little nugget that if you only accept input that flatters you, you're not growing, you're curating a fan club. That's not an easy thing for people to understand, is that everyone is president of their own fan club, even our self-deprecating friends, because that can be their brand. Their ego says, I feel better when I self-deprecate so that you don't do it. If I do it first, I've lost a ton of weight, like hundreds and hundreds of pounds. And when I was at my heaviest, I would walk into a room and I would spot check to see if I was the largest person in the room. cocktail party, social event, work event, movie theater. Doesn't matter what it was, because that was ingrained in my head. And if I was the biggest person, then I would make the fat joke first, because then it's my joke and I own it. If someone else made it at my expense, I'd be devastated. I'd be mortified. I would hold it in and then I'd go home and eat food to feel better. We are sometimes creating our own issues because of the way we think, but we're not actually thinking and aware of how we're thinking. That's where self-awareness comes in. So if you're constantly in that position where you're making bad choices or the outcomes are not as great as you want them to be, you have to look in the mirror first.
That brings us to the point of the need for realism. Like, you need to be aware of the situation as it is, not as you would wish to project it onto the world. And it's hard to face the truth sometimes. And a lot of people would rather tell themselves comforting lies rather than dealing with the hard truth of what it is they're dealing with. So finance requires seeing the world as it is, not as you wish it to be. But I think leadership and decision making in the wider world, if you're in the corporate world, is very similar. You need to be able to assess the ground game as it really is, and as opposed to telling yourself happy lies. Maybe we can talk about that for a moment. Tell me about being realistic in the way you assess it.
So people deceive themselves about their happiness, relationships, and purpose, opting for blissful ignorance over meaningful change until reality interrupts their illusion. And when reality does set in, do they accept it or do they start blaming others for the bad decisions? If they're already struggling to accept responsibility or accountability for those bad decisions or choices, why would this now be any different? You know, the amazing author Brené Brown talks so much about asking people about, are you happy? And people struggle to answer that question. So I started doing that in my coaching practice, executive life coaching, business related. And it's amazing to me how many people struggle with answering that question. They get very internalized, very defensive. What do you mean? It's a simple question. Are you happy? And what happens is, and what Brené Brown talks about is, you can't selectively numb. When you're in that mode of being down in that pool of despair and don't realize you're in that pool of despair, you can't numb. If you numb pain, you're numbing joy. So when you ask somebody, or you look in the mirror and ask yourself, are you happy? And you can't answer that question, or you struggle to answer that, that's your ego fighting the resistance that you've created yourself. So self-awareness starts at the moment you really stop blaming the world for your own bullshit, and that you actually start living your life in a way that serves you. Because when you're at your best and you're focused on true, authentic living, we're not 100% authentic all the time, but if you're masking and lying to yourself, what is that doing to your brand? What is that doing to your relationships? What is that doing to maybe your investments or your inability to make the right choices that are actually going to better serve the longer term plan, as opposed to living in the moment for that external gratification or validation that really at the end of the day doesn't mean anything? Because you can get all the applause you want from everyone else, but if you're hurting inside and you're not being true to you, how much does that external applause really mean when you think about it, right? Financial loss is measurable, but emotional loss, less visible, but often more damaging. And, I'd like to say you can't invoice your heart, but you'll feel the way that it costs. If the truth makes you uncomfortable, that's probably where your work starts. And you can't heal what you keep pretending doesn't hurt. And then self-awareness isn't sexy, it's just necessary. And comfort zones, I love the whole concept of comfort zones, but it's not about stepping outside of it, it's making it bigger. Because comfort zones are really just padded rooms for your potential when you really think about it, right? And that if your story sounds noble, but your outcomes are a dumpster fire, maybe it's time you need to start looking at how to rewrite that script.
So let's talk about rewriting that script and being flexible and breaking free from rigid thinking, because a lot of us use rigid thinking as a way of self-preservation and pushing things into the background so you don't have to deal with things because they're just too painful. A lot of investors cling to old strategies that oftentimes they don't want to acknowledge that the world is changing in terms of what they could be doing and what's going on with valuations, what's going on with geopolitics. So a lot of people will still have a paradigm of how to invest. And I'm not saying that any paradigm is wrong up and by itself, but situations evolve, situations change. And at the very least, you should be able to stop, reflect upon what's going on, and make sure that the paradigm you're using is still appropriate for the circumstances we're in right now. So that rigidity can be a problem. It's always a potential problem. And you need to stop on a regular basis and say, wait a minute, am I still thinking about things properly? Or are there other things that are coming into play that might not have been in my radar, or I might not have an aptitude in because it's like AI or whatever, something that's new and that you don't have familiarity with. And as a result, you push it aside because it forces you to change your paradigm of how things work in what to do. And of course, if you think you've got it all figured out, what's the old line about, just when I had all the answers, someone went and changed the questions. Well, that's what we're dealing with here, is that a lot of time the world changes and you need
Right.
to break from the rigidity. So maybe you can offer your thoughts on life and adaptation.
Life demands adaptation. There's no question. Clinging to outdated beliefs, habits, identities is a absolute 100% surefire way to achieve stagnation, regret, and potentially a lifetime of missed opportunities. And the real challenge of the decade is figuring out why we wear these masks, for how long we've been hiding behind them, and then finally peeling it off once and for all. But who needs progress when you have denial? It's not just a river in Egypt, right? The way I look at flexibility is rigidity is the ego's last line of defense. And it keeps you locked in familiar patterns under the illusion of safety. That's what the ego is for. And we sometimes blame the ego when it's actually really us. It's that whole fight or flight response, right? But life doesn't care about your comfort zone. It will drag you kicking, screaming, unprepared into that change if you let it. But if you're not willing to adapt, don't be surprised when you get left behind, whether it's professionally, personally, emotionally, or maybe financially. So those masks that we wear, we're not just hiding from others, we're actually hiding from ourselves. And that flexibility is just about changing course. That's what this is really all about, right? Like, that's what this is all about. Unmasking those illusions is recognizing you're on the wrong road and you need to change that, but you're in control. You can't be dragged there. So it's about finding that courage to be honest enough to admit the old path isn't working anymore, because your identity is built on outdated coping strategies, outdated ways of thinking. You end up being your own problem that you don't admit having. And that's where things get confusing. So if you're always just being yourself, maybe that's part of the issue. Maybe you're not being true to who you believe you are, or who you're branding, or who you're marketing. Evolve, repeat. It's not a suggestion, it's your default setting. Comfort zone didn't get smaller, you just stopped growing. So when you think about it, it's about growth, but you control the growth.
Excellent. All right. I like to end by asking my guests a simple question. So the podcast is called Make Better Wealth Decisions. What would you, a consultant who helps people be more self-aware, counsel my listeners in order for them to make better wealth decisions?
Love it. I got 3 key points for you and your listeners. So get brutally honest with yourself. You got to stop saying it'll be fine when you know it won't. And you can start with this question. What truth am I avoiding because it's inconvenient or uncomfortable? When you think about that, so you don't need therapy to know that you're lying to yourself, right? You just need the courage to admit it. So write it down, say it out loud. Reality has never been the villain. Your denial is the villain. So that would be number 1. Number 2 would be audit your ego's greatest hits. So when you think about your most pertinent excuses, defensiveness, or the I'm just being me moments, label each one for what it is, which is really ego protection. So ask yourself, is the behavior helping me grow, or is it just keeping me safe? If you're curating that fan club instead of a feedback loop, you're not growing, you're just managing your brand. And then third and final is choose growth over familiarity every damn time. Change doesn't feel good. It feels foreign, especially if you're not used to or comfortable with change. But if you want different results, you're going to need a different input. And so break the cycle by doing those things you would normally avoid. Sign up for that workshop, leave that job if it's the right time, apologize first to get rid of that, move more towards kindness than being right. Wear that metaphorical helmet, because staying the same is also a choice. And when you think about it, if all of this sounds like, yes, but I'm sort of struggling, it hasn't actually been working so far yet, has it? So maybe that's the growth catalyst for change, just hearing what we're talking about. And if I break it up into one sentence for you, based on these 4 areas, most of us are walking around with overpriced illusions and an underdeveloped self-awareness. We overstate our immunity to risk, which is your optimism bias, defend bad decisions with emotional gymnastics, which is our behavioral biases. We avoid truth like it has fangs, which is our realism deficit. And then we cling to outdated versions of ourselves like they still work, which is our reality in disguise. The ego doesn't want growth. It wants comfort. It wants control, and it wants compliments. So are you going to protect your ego with those illusions to keep paying for them, which is going to impact your relationships, finances, career, self-worth? Or do you want to stop outsourcing responsibility and accountability? Start asking yourself those harder questions, because it starts from within. It isn't about shame. It's about finally getting honest, because the truth might hurt, but at least it won't lie to you anymore.
So once again, everyone, this has been Mark Robinson. He is the curator of a website called shittyleaders.ca and the author of a book, Unmasking Your Illusions. Mark, I want to thank you for your time today. It's been really enjoyable, and it's just a pleasure to speak with someone who sees the world much the way I do. Again, leaving my ego aside and just saying it's just nice to have someone who sees things and tries to be as realistic as possible. I'm a big proponent of radical truth. So thank you for your time today, and I want to wish you all the best with the book going forward.
Really appreciate it. Thank you to you and your listeners.
This podcast is not to be construed as offering specific investment advice. Please consult a qualified advisor before acting. My books, Stand Up to the Financial Services Industry and Bullshift, are available online. If you'd like to meet to discuss how the topics in this podcast affect you directly, please visit my website.